The wind came first, a thin, high-pitched shriek that swept over the plains like a ghost's warning. It wasn't the kind of wind that whispered. It howled, sharp and cruel, promising a winter that would come early and hit hard. Then came the snow, not soft like feathers, but jagged like glass, lashing sideways and turning the sky and earth into one gray blur. Wyoming Territory in the 1880s wasn't built for the faint-hearted. The distant mountains, hunched in purple and black, stood like ancient sentinels, cold and uncaring. Beneath them lay the rotting shell of a wagon, broken down along an old mining trail. Curled in the shadow of its axle was what looked like a discarded heap of rags. But it wasn't rags. It was a woman. Her name, for now, was Nita. She was pressed so deep into the frozen mud and grass that she nearly vanished into the earth. But the wind still found her, slicing through the thin shawl she clung to, wrapped over a dress torn to shreds. Her skin clung tight to her bones, her cheeks hollow, her jaw marked with a bruise the color of rotting fruit. Sweat and grime matted her hair. She was barefoot, her feet torn and blackened from cold and stone. Fever had her now, not the kind born of snow, but the kind that burns from inside. She'd been running for 3, maybe 4 days. Time had melted into a fog of fear and hunger. When she closed her eyes, the world slipped away. Abel Harkin heard the wind, but felt no cold. This country had shaped him, or maybe shattered him enough to belong to it. He was a large man, carved from bone and sinew, moving with a deliberate, weighty step. He led Buckshot, his mule, loaded with 2 deer still steaming in the cold. He was headed home, if the small cabin tucked away in the cliffs could be called that. His face was a map of past sins, a long silver scar dragged from the corner of his left eye to his jaw, pulling his expression into something grim and unreadable. Knife work. From another life he had buried years back. He spotted the wagon first. His hand dropped instinctively to the rifle slung at his saddle. Strangers weren't neighbors up here. They were trouble. Strangers meant law. They meant questions. They meant the past, clawing its way to his door. He circled the wagon, eyes sweeping the snow. Only one trail, small, stumbling, bare feet nearly wiped clean by the storm. Then he saw her. A bundle of cloth and bones beneath the axle. His gut told him to ride on. That was the smart play. Stay out of it. Keep your head down. But something in him, some damn fool part, refused to leave a thing to die like that. Not even a coyote. He stood there a long moment, snow crusting on his shoulders, his hat, while Buckshot shifted impatiently behind him. He swore under his breath and crouched, his coat creaking. He reached out and touched her shoulder. She was terrifyingly light. Cold bones in torn cloth. He pulled her out. She was unconscious, breathing shallow and rough. Her face a ruin, wrists too thin for any kind of life she'd come from. He exhaled, a puff of steam, then lifted her like one of the deer and laid her over the mule. He tied her down and turned toward the cliffs. His cabin wasn't much, just a squat box of hand-cut timber, hidden deep in a cleft where wind couldn't bite so hard. Smoke-black stone fireplace, 1 table, 2 chairs, a cot, skins in the corner. Smelled like pine, leather, and smoke. A place to be alone. He brought her in, awkward in the presence of something so broken. He built the fire high, boiled water, worked with the quiet precision of someone used to doing things alone. Her dress was frozen stiff, speckled with blood. He cut it away carefully with his skinning knife, eyes never lingering. Bruises littered her ribs and back. Old, new. A brand, dark and mean, marked the back of her shoulder. A miner's pick and a letter. His jaw clenched. He washed her with a warm rag, then slid one of his wool shirts onto her limp arms. He covered her with his heaviest bearskin. Her feet he cleaned with whiskey. She flinched, even unconscious, and he wrapped them in linen strips. Then he sat across the room, staring into the fire. He'd brought the storm inside. Nita woke with a scream caught in her throat. The heat of the fire frightened her. Heat meant walls, and walls meant men. She sat bolt upright, heart pounding, clutching the wool shirt around her. Eyes wide, breath fast, she took in the low ceiling, the rifles on the wall. Then him. He was at the hearth, running a whetstone along the length of a blade. Shing. Shing. That was the only sound besides the wind. He didn't look at her, just stopped sharpening and waited. "Where am I?" Her voice cracked, dry as dust. He wiped the blade on his leg. His eyes met hers, ice blue, sharp as mountain frost. "My cabin," he said, voice rough as gravel. "You're safe from the storm." Safe? The word was a lie. No place was safe. She tried to scramble back, but pain lanced up her legs from her bandaged feet. She was trapped. Again. "Don't," she choked, hugging the shirt tighter. "Don't you touch me." Abel didn't move. He hadn't gotten out of the chair, still a good 10 feet away. "Wasn't planning on it," he said simply. Then he stood. She flinched, curled tighter. He was massive, larger than any man she'd ever seen, all rough edges and brute force. He walked to the fire, lifted a tin cup of broth, and set it down halfway between them. "Drink that," he said. He nudged it closer with his boot. "You're weak." Then he returned to his chair, picked up the knife again, but didn't sharpen it. Just stared into the flames. Nita eyed the cup. Could be poison, could be a trap. But the smell, meat, salt, punched into her empty gut like a hammer. Her stomach cramped hard. She waited. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just sat there, a mountain of a man holding steel, ignoring her. This silence was worse than shouting. The men she knew before, they were loud, brutal, boasting, grabbing, laughing. This one watched and said nothing. He watched her with quiet patience as her trembling hands reached for the cup. The tin was hot against her fingers, but she lifted it anyway, bringing it to her lips. The broth seared down her throat, pain and comfort at once. It filled the hollow ache in her belly, and a small sound escaped her, half sob, half sigh. Still, she didn't stop until every drop was gone. Abel Harkin said nothing. He fed her 3 times a day. First plain broth, then a thin stew with bits of goat meat. He'd set the bowl on the floor, shove it closer with his boot, and walk away. When he changed her bandages, his touch was steady and practical. Never soft, never lingering. He only spoke if she did first, and even then his answers were blunt. Yes. No. Rest. When Nita finally slept, the nightmares came. She was back in that tent they'd called a saloon, a long, drafty thing of canvas and timber with sawdust floors to soak up spilled whiskey and blood. The air stank of sweat, cheap perfume, and desperation. She had arrived there chasing a lie, told she'd be a dancer on a real stage. But there was no stage, only a rough floor where drunken miners crowded close, their hands greedy, their eyes hungry. She poured drinks, laughed at foul jokes, sat on laps she wanted to flee from. She smiled until her face ached. That was how you survived, smiling while your soul starved. Then Silas Gant appeared. He wasn't a miner. He was a trader, a man who dealt in whiskey, mules, and women. He paid her debt to the camp owner in a flash of gold coins. The owner had charged her for passage, food, even the torn dress she'd been given. The debt was a chain she could never break. But Silas bought it. Bought her. "You're mine now, Nita," he'd whispered, his breath hot against her ear, fingers gripping her chin. "Every piece of you." At first he was generous. New dresses of red silk and blue velvet, fine boots, the illusion of freedom. But soon it turned to ownership. The money from her entertainment went straight into his pockets. When she refused a man he pointed to, he struck her, his ring cutting her lip. The next night, he branded her, heated iron pressed to her shoulder while she screamed. His mark burned deep. The escape came in chaos. A drunken fight, a stove kicked over, smoke and fire spreading. She ran barefoot through the mud and darkness, her fancy boots falling to pieces on the rocks. She ran until her breath tore her chest open, until the trees swallowed her, until she found that broken wagon and the snow. She woke gasping, the smell of smoke clinging to her. The cabin was dim, the fire burning low. Abel slept in his chair, the heavy bearskin once over her now draped across his shoulders. His head leaned back against the wall, the fire painting him in gold and shadow. He looked younger in sleep. The scar that hardened his face softened, but his hands, his enormous hands, were still clenched, even in dreams. She noticed old scars on his knuckles, white against the firelight. He too was haunted. He wasn't dreaming of a saloon. He was far south, Texas, years ago, back when he was a ranch hand, quick with a rope, strong as an ox. His size had made him useful for breaking horses and hauling feed. But it had also made him dangerous. The foreman, Clyde Barker, was a small man with a cruel streak. He bullied the workers and cornered the kitchen girls, using his position like a weapon. One day, Abel caught him pinning a new girl, Lila, barely 16, in the stables. Abel grabbed him by the collar to pull him away. The man swung. Abel swung back. Only once. That one hit broke the man's neck. Abel stood frozen, staring at the body on the ground, at the sobbing girl, at his own massive hands. He knew how it would look. A respected foreman dead, a quiet ranch hand standing over him. No one would call it mercy. They'd call it murder. So he saddled a horse and rode north, changed his name, worked odd jobs, kept moving until he found the mountains. Here, his size was only another tool for survival. Here, silence was a shield. He'd been hiding from the world and the law for 8 long years, until Nita. Her fever finally broke. Her feet began to heal. Hunger gave way to restless strength. The cabin that had saved her now felt like a prison, and her jailer was the silent man who shared it. Abel's quiet unnerved her. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of someone who refused to be known. She'd spent her life among men who always wanted something. Their hunger was easy to read. This man? He wanted nothing. He cooked. He mended. He cleaned his rifle. He treated her like another living thing to keep alive. A goat, maybe. She began to suspect that his quiet was a mask, that his calm hid something darker. She wanted to see him break. "You ever get lonely up here?" she asked one night. The wind howled outside, fierce and endless. He was mending a snowshoe, didn't look up. "No." "Most men would be," she pressed. "I ain't most men." "I can see that," she shot back, pulling the blanket tighter. "Most men don't live like badgers in a hole. What are you hiding from?" His hands stopped moving. His eyes lifted, cold and sharp as steel. You should rest." "I'm tired of resting," she snapped, rising to her feet. The wool shirt he'd given her fell to her knees. "I'm tired of you watching me like I'm something broken. Why did you bring me here? What do you want from me?" "I wanted," he said slowly, voice low and dangerous, "to keep you from freezing to death." "People don't do things for nothing," she hissed. "Not where I come from. Are you waiting for me to get strong again? Is that it? You want payment for the broth?" He rose then, and the small cabin seemed to shrink. He towered over her, a shadow that swallowed her whole. Her heart pounded, but she held her ground. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "Then why do you look at me?" she demanded. "I see you, Abel. When you think I'm not looking. What's wrong, cowboy? Too afraid to take what you want?" She was baiting him, trying to shape him into something familiar. If he became like the men she knew, the ones who took and hurt, she'd know how to survive him. But he didn't move. His face was unreadable, hard as the stone outside. Then, without a word, he turned away. He grabbed his coat from the peg. "Where are you going?" she challenged. "To check the goats. Storm's easing." "It's the middle of the night," she shot back. "You're a coward." His hand rested on the latch. "No," he said quietly. "Just a man who knows his own strength." He opened the door and vanished into the white silence. The cabin felt colder without him. She lay awake for hours, staring at the dying fire, her anger turning to something else, something she didn't want to name. When she finally rose, she walked the small cabin, her bare feet brushing against the rough wood floor. It was still warm where he'd sat. The night outside was silent as a grave. She wandered quietly through the cabin, brushing her fingers across his things. The heavy axe resting near the door, the dented tin coffee pot, a few weathered books with cracked spines. There was the Bible, and beside it, a book on animal husbandry. Then, tucked in a wooden crate beneath a neat stack of cured hides, she found it. A small, leather-bound journal, the cover worn smooth from years of touch. She hesitated. It was his, and it was private. But Abel Harkin himself was a locked gate, and she needed to know what was behind it. Her hand moved before her conscience could stop her. She opened the book. It wasn't what she expected. Not a ledger. Not a list of kills or debts or sins. The first page held a charcoal sketch of a hawk, each feather drawn with striking care, the eyes wild and sharp. She turned the page. A pine cone, exactly shaped like the mountain peak visible from the cabin window. Then a goat, mid-step, with an almost comical expression. Between the drawings were lines of words, not quite poems, more like murmured thoughts. Wind is high. Snow will be deep before morning. The old pine split. Saw a wolf track. Big male. He's hungry too. The silence is a good neighbor. It asks for nothing. She flipped through page after page. The sketches were delicate. The handwriting clean, deliberate. This wasn't the work of a brute. This was the work of a man who looked, really looked, and carried more inside than he ever let show. Nita sat cross-legged by the fire, the book open in her lap. That's when the door opened. Abel stepped in, snow trailing behind him. He stamped off his boots and saw her, saw the journal. Nita froze, expecting him to shout, to storm across the room and rip it from her hands. Maybe even finally show the anger she kept poking at like a wound. But he just stood there, looked at her, then at the book. And in that moment, a deep, bone-weary sadness crept over his face. He said nothing. He moved to the fire, picked up the coffee pot, and began brewing. Nita shut the journal. Her hand trembled as she held it out. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He took it silently, placed it carefully back into the crate without ever looking at her. Then came his voice, flat, resigned. Snow's 10 feet deep in the pass. Nothing's getting in or out for a while. He poured 2 cups, handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. She flinched. He recoiled, as though burned. They sat across from one another in silence, each nursing coffee as the sun began to stretch across the white, buried world. The snow had trapped them, and with it came a fragile kind of truce. The cabin became their whole world, a square box of logs swallowed in a sea of white. The snow didn't let up. It buried the windows. Each morning, Abel dug a trench to the door, shovel scraping through blue pre-dawn light. Survival wasn't a decision. It was a rhythm. Chop, haul, mend, cook, do it again. He wouldn't let her disappear into sleep and silence. One morning he tossed her a pair of wool mittens, his own, worn thin. "You'll need to learn the wood," he said. "I can't haul for 2. She looked at them, then up at his face. She took them. He led her to the woodshed, where stacks of logs sat protected under a lean-to. He handed her the small axe he used for kindling. "Not like that," he said, as she gripped it like a club. He stepped close, adjusted her hands, his rough fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. His skin was warm despite the chill. She jerked back. He showed her how to split the logs. His movements were efficient, patient. Let the weight do the work. Nita tried. The axe was heavy, and her arms were thin, unfamiliar with labor. She brought it down, missed. The blade bit the chopping block. She tried again. The log skittered away untouched. Her face burned. Frustration stung her eyes. "I can't," she said, voice tight. "Yes, you can," Abel replied without looking at her. "You just ain't done it yet. Try again." She hated that he didn't pity her. Every man she'd ever known used pity as a doorway. Abel didn't. He just stood there, solid, unflinching, expecting her to work. She gritted her teeth, lifted the axe, and swung. This time it hit, off-center, but hard enough to split the log. One half flew into the snow. Breathless, she stared at it. It was the first useful thing she'd done in a year. She didn't look at him, just grabbed the other half and reset it on the block. He taught her to set snares, took her out on snowshoes, awkward, slow treks through the pine woods. He never pointed with fingers, only a small nod of the chin. "There, rabbit run." He showed her how to spot the trail, how to tie a slip knot in the wire, how to anchor it to a sapling. Her hands shook. She remembered another time they'd trembled, pouring whiskey for Silas Gant, trying not to spill. He'd struck her for it. Abel noticed the scars on her knuckles, watched her fingers tremble. But he said nothing, just took the wire, shaped the loop again, and placed it back in her hand. "Gently," he said. "It's got to be a whisper, or they'll feel it. They'll know." She burned the bannock, dropped the water bucket, lost half the haul, had to walk with him back to the stream. But she never cried in front of him. If she cried at all, it was with her back turned, swiping at her face like it had betrayed her. She refused pity, and for that, Abel respected her. In return, she began to reclaim the space. It was his cabin, but she was living in it. She wouldn't live in filth, not anymore. While he worked outside, she cleaned. No broom, so she made one from pine boughs tied to a stick. She swept the packed dirt floor until it looked clean enough to eat on. She scrubbed the table with lye and hot water until the wood shone pale and smooth. The air began to smell different, less like goat and damp fur, more like pine and soap. She found his mending kit. The needle was thick, the thread coarse. She sat under the heavy bearskin by the fire and stitched the torn blankets with small, neat lines. It was something she was good at, something from the life before the gold dust. Abel came in one afternoon, stomping snow from his boots. He stopped in the doorway, sniffed. The air had changed. He looked at the rafters, saw the pine boughs she'd hung, the cleaned table, the blanket he'd been using, now stitched. Then her. Sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts. The flames lit her hair like copper. For a flicker of a second, she looked like a wife, and the thought struck him like a knife. He recoiled, turned to the stove, threw in wood with more force than necessary. "The stovepipe's loose," he muttered. "Draft ain't right." The truce held through the weeks. The snow never stopped. They lived like two wild animals sharing territory. Careful, quiet, never touching what couldn't be undone. They didn't speak of the past, or the future, but the stove was a problem. The pipe that ran through the roof had a bad joint. It leaked smoke. On windy nights, sparks flew back into the room. "One good backdraft'll torch the roof," Abel said one afternoon. The light outside was already fading. "Storm's coming. We need to fix it." It took both of them to fix it. Abel climbed up through the snow to reach the roof, while Nita stayed below, holding the pipe steady. The iron burned through her mittens as she gripped it, head tilted back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "All right," came his voice, muffled by wind and snow. "Hold it. Don't let it turn." She held firm. The heat seeped through her gloves. She heard the crunch of his boots above, a grunt, the scrape of metal against ice, then a curse followed by a thud. "Abel," she called, panic in her voice. "I'm fine," he grunted. "Patch of ice. Hold it still. I've almost got it." A shower of soot rained down, and then an ember, glowing orange, dropped through the joint. It landed on her shoulder. She gasped. The smell hit her first. Burning wool. Smoke curled from the fabric. She wanted to swat at it, but her hands were locked on the pipe. "Abel!" she cried, her voice rising. The door burst open. He must have jumped straight from the roof. He filled the doorway, his face dark against the white world outside. He saw the small flame eating through her shirt. He moved like lightning. 3 strides, and he was on her. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the front of the wool shirt and ripped it open, tearing it from her shoulder. The sound was violent, final. He threw the smoking cloth to the floor and crushed it under his boot. The cabin went still. The wind howled outside, but inside, nothing. Nita stood frozen. The cold air hit her bare skin. From her neck to her ribs, she was exposed, the torn shirt hanging loose. He stood a foot away, chest heaving, the ragged piece of fabric still in his hand. His eyes, once fixed on the fire, lifted, then froze on the marks. The bruises he'd seen when she was unconscious had faded, yellow-green ghosts. But there were others, old, permanent. Scars of teeth, of fists, of men. A bite mark near her heart. And lower, barely visible above her ribs, the ugly brand burned into her skin. The miner's pick and letter. She was a map of every cruelty the world had given her. Abel stared, his throat tight. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't cover herself. She was waiting for him to finish what others had started. The silence between them burned hotter than the fire ever had. Abel looked down at his hand, the one that had torn the shirt. The same hand that had once killed a man. He dropped the cloth, stiffly turned away, and crossed the room. He grabbed a clean wool shirt from his bunk and came back, holding it out without a word. Nita's hands shook as she took it. She turned away, wrapping herself in the torn remains while fumbling with the new one. He didn't move. He just stood there, a silent wall, until she was dressed again. "The stove's fixed," he said finally, his voice rough and low. He grabbed his coat and stepped out into the storm. That night, the tension was a third body in the room. Abel sat in his chair, cleaning his rifle, a job he'd already done that morning. Nita sat on the cot, wrapped in a blanket, knees drawn tight. The fire cracked, the wind moaned, and neither of them spoke. Until she did. "Why?" Her voice was small, fragile. He didn't look up. "Why what? Why did you turn away?" He set the rifle down. The cloth in his hand went still. "Turn away from what?" "This afternoon." She swallowed. "You saw." He lifted his eyes. The firelight flickered between them. The ice in his gaze was gone. Only weariness remained. "What did you want me to do, Nita?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Shout, yell, anything." He was quiet for a long while. The fire crackled softly. "You're afraid," she said finally. "Aren't you? I thought it was me you were hiding from. But it's not. You're afraid of me. Or maybe, of yourself." Abel rubbed a hand over his scarred face, the sound of skin against stubble harsh in the quiet. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. "Both," he said. His voice was barely more than a rasp. "I'm afraid of both." The truth hung heavy in the air, raw, honest, unguarded. He was afraid of her, of the softness she brought into his world of solitude, afraid of the warmth that could shatter his silence. But more than that, he was afraid of himself, of the hands that once broke instead of saved. Days passed, the snow kept falling, and so did the silence between them. One night, the world felt too still, too suffocating. Nita's eyes kept drifting to the flask of whiskey on the shelf. "I want some," she said suddenly. Abel looked up. "It ain't for ladies." "I'm not a lady," she said flatly. "Stopped being one when my father sold me for $10 and a mule. Give me the whiskey." He hesitated, then rose and handed her the flask along with a tin cup. She pushed the cup away, brought the flask straight to her lips. The burn was sharp, pure, a clean fire spreading through her chest and limbs. It was warmth without fear, for once. She drank again. "Go slow," he warned. She laughed, a sound dry and bitter. "Don't you tell me to go slow?" The whiskey loosened her. It softened the edges of every scar, every memory. For a moment the world blurred. The gold dust, the noise, the hands, the shame, all of it fell away. She stood. The room tilted slightly. He was watching her, face unreadable in the firelight. She saw him not as the hulking man who'd saved her, but as what he truly was, a lonely, kind, broken soul. And she, a lonely, shattered woman. There was one thing she had always known how to give. It was all she had left. She walked to him. He looked up. His eyes warned her before his words did. "Nita," he said quietly. "Don't." "You saved me," she whispered. "You fed me. You never hurt me. Let me thank you." "I don't want your gratitude," he said, voice tense. He didn't move. "Every man wants something," she said softly. She untied the laces at the front of the wool shirt. The firelight bled across her skin. The bruises, the brand. "This is all I have," she said. "Let me pay my way." She reached for him. He caught her wrists. His grip was firm but not cruel. He held her still, eyes locked with hers. "No," he said. "Why?" she cried, shame and whiskey tangled in her throat. Am I not good enough? Too ruined? Stop, he said, the word breaking in his mouth. He stood, towering, trembling, and stepped back. I'm too big for you, Nita, he said, voice raw. I don't care. He pressed a hand to his chest. Not just here. His fingers curled into a fist over his heart. I'm too big in the places that hurt. He looked down at his hands, scarred and ugly. I break things. Things I don't mean to. I ain't the man you should offer yourself to. He reached forward, gently closing her shirt, his rough fingers fumbling with the buttons. Go to sleep, he said softly. You're drunk. The shame came hard and cold. He had refused her, not with disgust, but with mercy. And somehow that made it worse. She turned away, face burning, and stumbled back to the cot. Buried her head in the pillow. Abel sat by the fire for hours, watching the flames, listening to the wind. He thought she was asleep. She wasn't. She lay there in the dark, the shame cooling into something colder, hard, flinty, like river stones under snow. He'd turned her down, treated her like she was fragile, like she needed shielding. Silas Gant had struck her with fists and backhands, carved his cruelty into her skin without apology. But Abel Harkin, he'd wounded her worse. He hadn't used his hands. He'd used mercy. That was the difference. Silas saw her as a thing to be owned. Abel saw her as a thing to be spared. And neither one of them saw her. She would not be coddled. She would not be put behind glass. She rose from the cot. The fire had burned down to a soft, red glow, the cabin thick with quiet. Abel was still in the chair, head leaned back, hat low over his brow. But she knew he wasn't sleeping. He was waiting. She walked toward him, silent as frost, didn't speak, didn't ask. She climbed into his lap, straddled him, the hem of his shirt hiked around her thighs. Her hands settled on his shoulders. She was shaking inside, but her face was stone. Try me anyway, she whispered. His eyes snapped open, his breath hitched. His hands rose, slow, heavy, hovering near her waist. He could have crushed her, could have thrown her across the room, could have taken what she offered. But he didn't. He set his hands on her hips, strong and careful, and lifted her like she weighed nothing. Stood her gently on the floor as if she were made of spun glass. He said nothing. Just looked at her with a kind of sorrow she hadn't seen before. He hadn't taken, but he hadn't turned away either. The burn of his hands lingered for nights afterward, warmer than the fire, sharper than any blade. The silence between them changed. It wasn't the hush of strangers anymore. It was the tension of two souls circling the same fire, knowing exactly what could be lit. The next morning, Abel left early. He was gone so long the kettle boiled dry. When he came back, he was dragging 2 pine trunks behind him. Snow clung to his coat. He didn't speak, just set to work outside, cutting and lashing wood together with rawhide. He was building a second cot. Nita watched him from the door, heart in her throat. He was putting space between them again. Walls. Quiet ones. She didn't remember picking up the axe. But there it was in her hand. She walked out and stood beside him. He didn't look up until she spoke. It's good work. He straightened, blinking. It'll keep you comfortable. I'm sure it will, she said. Then she swung. The axe bit into pine. She swung again, harder this time. All the shame, the nights in the saloon, the torn silences and unspoken rules, she put them into every strike. The cot split. The lashings snapped. She stood there, chest heaving, breath fogging in the winter air. Abel stared, stunned. I won't sleep across the room like a stranger, she said. voice shaking but sure. She dropped the axe in the snow and walked back inside. Sat by the fire with her back to him, waiting. For yelling, for the door to slam. But he came in quiet, took his time, gathered the broken cot piece by piece, and fed it to the fire without a word. The wall was gone. From then on, they touched. Not like lovers, not yet, but like two people building something with calloused hands and tender hearts. He brushed her fingers when handing her a cup. She didn't flinch. She cursed one day when burrs caught in her hair. "Hold still," he said, and worked them free with hands that could split wood, but somehow didn't pull. She patched his coat while he watched her stitch. He reached out once. Thumb brushed her cheek. She leaned into it. Just a second. They were mending. Together. Hope was small and green and shivering in the frost, but it was growing. Then came the tracks. He'd gone high up the ridge checking traps. The snow told a story. It always did. And someone had been there. One horse, one rider. Shot horse, city-trained. The rider had watched the cabin from the ridge, sat there a long time, then turned and left. Abel crouched, swept away the tracks, but he knew. The world had found him. When he came down, something in him had changed. The warmth was gone. The man who had brushed her cheek had vanished, replaced by the one who had first found her, silent, scarred, and watching the woods like they might catch fire. He cleaned his rifle, sharpened his knife again and again. At night, he slept in the chair by the fire, knife in hand, thumb resting on the hilt, waiting. The peace was broken, not by them, but by whatever ghost rode that ridge. In the morning, Nita snapped. "Who are you waiting for?" Abel was splitting kindling. He froze, axe mid-air. "The snow's deep," he muttered, "but it'll melt." "That's not an answer," she said. "You sleep with a knife in your hand. You watch the trees like they're breathing. What am I to you now? A witness? A hostage?" He turned. His face was grim, the scar across his cheek pale as ash. "You think this is about you?" "I don't know what it's about," she shouted. "You don't speak. You just brood and pace and scare the hell out of me." His face softened. Just a little. He dropped the axe, ran a hand through his hair. "I found tracks," he said quietly. "One rider, sat on the ridge, watched the cabin, then left. But he'll be back." She swallowed. "A hunter?" "No." He shook his head. "Not a hunter." He looked past her, toward the fire. "I've been hiding a long time," he said. "Looks like I'm done hiding. Someone from before. They've come looking." And just like that, the truth settled between them. He wasn't just a man with a past. He was a man whose past had teeth. And now it had found them. But in that moment, looking into his eyes, those hunted, hollowed-out eyes, she felt it. That quiet, aching kinship. He was branded too, not on the skin, like her, but somewhere deeper. She sat down slow on the edge of the cot, her fingers tangled in her lap. "So, you're a man running from something?" "That's right," Abel said, flat as a hammer strike. He turned back to the kindling, shoulders squared like a man closing a door that had been cracked too wide. Nita swallowed. "My name. It ain't Clara," she said gently. He stopped. Turned toward her. Slowly. "Clara's the name they gave me at the gold dust," she said, eyes on the blanket she was twisting between her fingers. Sounded clean, like some girl up on a stage. "My real name's June." He didn't say a word, just looked at her, steady and still, waiting for the rest. Silas Gant. He called me Clara, too, but I was June when it happened. She drew a ragged breath. "I was 16. My father, he wasn't cruel, just weak. Loved the cards too much. Owed money to a man at the freight office, more than our farm in Missouri was ever worth. She looked up. Her eyes were glassy, but her voice didn't shake. He sold me. The words dropped like stones. He didn't use that word. Said it was an arrangement. I'd help the man's wife. Housework, cooking, just till the debt was paid. But there was no wife. Just a ledger, a wagon, a string of camps, and then the gold dust. The tears came, quiet but fierce. I hated him for it, but I hated myself worse, because I was good at it. Learned how to smile, learned how to pour the drinks, let him touch me without flinching, learned how to live through it. And Clara, she's the one who did all that, not June. June died back in Missouri. Abel crossed the cabin in 2 strides. He didn't sit. He crouched down in front of her, rough boots planted, hat still shadowing his eyes. He didn't speak, didn't reach, just listened. I ran, she finished. And I ended up here. Now your past's creeping up the ridge, and mine's never more than 1 step behind. He stayed quiet, watching her. His eyes fell to her brand, the one he'd seen that day by the stove. He understood now. June, he said, her name like a rope anchoring them both. Ain't no Clara in this cabin, and I sure as hell don't see no ghosts either. He reached for her hands, not her face, her hands, and gently unfurled her fists. The past always finds you. Doesn't matter how deep you bury it, but when it comes, only thing left to do is stand and face it. He stood again. Let's just hope it takes its time. The wind returned that night. But it didn't howl. It screamed, a high, thin shriek that made the cabin timbers tremble. The glass pane on the lone window froze over in a single sheet of white. Abel stared out at the sky, jaw tight. It's a big one, he said. Fill the buckets, all of them. And for the next 5 days, the world disappeared. The blizzard wasn't just snow. It was a full-blown, roaring void. Drifts rose higher than the roof. The sun vanished. Time blurred into a cold, colorless haze. No chopping wood, no setting traps, just firelight and each other. The tension from the stranger on the ridge melted into something else, into shared names, shared scars. There were no secrets left, only skin and silence. They sat by the fire, stitching things that didn't need stitching. She reworked the seams on his mittens. He carved a new handle for the coffee pot. Their talk stayed small. Snow patterns, goat habits. On the 3rd day, she broke the quiet. Tell me about the hawks, she said. He blinked. What? In your book, you draw them? He looked into the fire. They're free, he said. Ain't tied down. They see everything, and they're not afraid. They just are. Honest. On the 4th day, he was sketching again. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat off his side. She watched his hand, scarred and sure, move the charcoal. But he wasn't drawing a hawk. He was drawing her hand, the one mending the blanket. He paused when he noticed her watching. You see things, she whispered. You don't just look. You see. He closed the journal. The space between them hummed. It wasn't shame anymore. It was need. A raw, aching need to be touched, kindly, for once. When the wind finally stopped on the 5th night, the silence hit like a gunshot. The fire was low. The cabin bathed in warm, flickering amber. Abel sat in the old chair. June sat on the floor, back against the cot. It stopped, she said. Yeah. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched, brittle as glass. She stood. He watched her. His body went rigid. "June," he rasped, half warning, half prayer. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say my name like it's a sin." She knelt in front of him, hands resting on his knees, solid, unmoving. "You're scared," she said. "I told you," he muttered. "I break things. I'm too damn big. I'll hurt you." "You already hurt me," she said. "Every time you look away. Every time you treat me like I'm made of glass. I'm not. I'm old iron, Abel. I've been through the fire, and I'm still here." She leaned in. He didn't move. He was stone. She kissed him. His lips were dry, cracked. He didn't respond. "Abel," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to save me. Just see me, for tonight. Please." He made a sound. Low, rough. His hands, those massive, calloused hands, rose slow, not to take, to cradle. He cupped her face, thumbs brushing tears from her cheeks. Then he kissed her. It wasn't sweet. It was desperate. It was the kiss of hunger, of long nights in the cold. It tasted like smoke, salt, and memory. He pulled back, breath ragged. "We shouldn't. We must." He stood, lifting her like a whisper, laid her down on the cot, stood above her like a shadow cast by firelight. "I won't be a brute," he said, voice raw. "I won't be like them." "I know." Desire burned slow between hesitation and reverence. He undressed her with hands that trembled. He looked at her, the bruises, the brand, the small white scars. Not with lust, but with aching reverence. He kissed her shoulder. His lips brushed the old bite mark like a prayer. He wasn't claiming her. He was tending what had been broken. He paused, still holding back. "You warned me," she said, her voice rising, "that you were too big." She sat up, pushing the hair from her eyes. June now, fully, finally. "You were wrong." She wasn't a victim. She wasn't something bought or bartered. She was Nita. She pressed Abel back onto the cot, surprising him with her strength. His broad frame settled into the small space, exposed and still. She climbed over him, straddling his waist just as she had once in fury. But this wasn't fury. This was her choice. "You once said you were too big," she murmured, gazing down at him. "You were wrong. You're just right." His eyes closed. His hands rested gently on her hips, not to hold her down, but to hold himself together. It wasn't about control. It wasn't survival. It was the first time for her that it was choice. Pure, burning desire. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And for him, it was terrifying. And holy. A man built to break now asked to cradle. What unfolded between them was slow, jagged, and full of ache. But it healed something deep and ruined inside both of them. A promise carved in shadows, amidst a storm. A vow made in warmth and trembling breath. When the silence returned, it felt changed. Soft. Almost sacred. Then Abel stirred beneath her, sudden and sharp. He sat up, back turned, shoving his trousers on with shaking hands. "We shouldn't have done that," he said flatly. "Lifeless." The words hit Nita like cold water. She pulled the blanket tight around herself. Her bare skin stung with shame. He regretted it. She'd given something real, and now she was a mistake again. Just a body. Just Clara. "Why?" she asked, voice tight and brittle. "Was I not what you wanted?" He turned around, and the anguish on his face stopped her cold. "What I wanted," he rasped. His voice cracked open. "What I wanted." She sat up, blanket clenched to her chest. "Am I just another mistake? Another regret you'll bury?" "No!" His roar cracked through the cabin. His fist slammed against the log wall, making the whole place shudder. He stared at his bloodied knuckles. "No," he said again, quieter, shattered. He dropped to his knees beside her cot, took her hand in his scarred one. "I see you as forever, Nita," he whispered. "A forever I don't deserve. I'm a dead man, running from a rope. And what we just did, I tied you to that. To me. A man marked for hanging. I shouldn't have loved you." He hadn't said the word until now, but he had. Clear as thunder. She looked into his face, the face of a man who thought he was a monster, who feared not for himself, but for her. She touched his scar gently. "Abel," she said, "we're both broken. Maybe our broken pieces fit." Days passed. The storm cleared. Spring light filled the world. Abel had gone out to check the traps, leaving her space. Nita found a pale piece of birch bark in the kindling box. She picked up his knife from the table, sat by the fire with sunlight glowing in her hair. Her hands were steady. She carved a W, then a J, tied them with a strip of rawhide. That night, they shared the cot. It was tight, but neither cared. When Abel finally drifted into sleep, slow and deep, she slid the small carving under his flat, worn pillow. A vow. The snow began to melt, and with it came the world. He heard the sound first, a horse struggling through deep, wet snow, not the crisp trot of winter, but the labored slosh of thaw. Abel was on his feet, rifle in hand, before she even sat up. "What is it?" she asked. "Stay down," he said, scraping frost off the window pane. A man approached, on a fine black horse, dark wool coat, city hat. Two rougher riders followed on trail-worn horses. "Who is it?" she whispered. Abel's voice went hard. "They ride like bounty men." The man in the lead sat tall in the saddle, scanning the small cabin below like he was weighing whether to buy it or burn it. Nita stepped beside him, peering through the ice-crusted window. Her breath stopped. She saw the sharp beard, the cold eyes, the silver flask drawn from his coat. Her voice died in her throat. "I know him," she whispered. Abel didn't look away. "Who is he?" "That's Silas Gant," she said, the name like poison. "He's the one who owned me." Abel saw her terror. Pure and animal. Then he looked back out. They weren't just riders from his past. They were hers too. He cocked the rifle. The click echoed like Judgment Day. "Abel," she whispered, gripping his arm. "Don't kill, not for me. Killing ruins people. Don't let it ruin you." He looked at her hand, then at the men closing in. "Go to the back," he said low and calm. "Bar the door. No matter what you hear, don't come out." She nodded. Pale, shaking, she barred the rear door as he taught her, and waited. By the hearth, her hand rested on the iron shovel near the fire's embers. Outside, Abel stepped onto the porch, rifle lowered across his waist, muzzle pointed skyward. 3 horses stopped 20 yards out. Silas Gant sat like a man who never worked a day in dirt. His coat was fine wool, his smile thin, smug. "I'm looking for a red-headed girl," he called. "Name of Nita. You seen her?" "There's no one by that name," Abel said. "This is my land. Ride on." Silas grinned wider. "Nita!" he bellowed. "Come on out, girl. Debt's still on my books." "She's a runaway," he said to Abel, waving forged papers. "Owned legal, writ signed and sealed." "That paper's a lie," Abel growled. "She's not property," he added, "and she's not coming out." Silas's smile faded. "So that's how it is," he spat. "Found yourself a new master, huh?" he sneered. "Tell me, cowboy, how is she? Still got that little trick with her? Enough. Abel's grip went white. 3 seconds to ride away, he warned. 1. He lowered the rifle, rested it by the door. Silas smirked. A fistfight, then? He nodded at the man beside him. Go get her. The bounty man dismounted, whip in hand. Quick work, he grunted. Abel stepped into the snow. 2 strides. The whip snapped. Abel caught it mid-air. Yanked. The man stumbled forward, surprised. She's not yours, Abel growled, then swung. 1 punch, like thunder cracking bone. The man dropped, out cold in the snow. The second hunter reached for his gun. But Silas was faster. A silver-plated pistol drawn from his coat. Nita! Abel shouted. She had unbarred the door. Silas turned, saw her. There you are, you bitch! He aimed at her. Abel roared, too far to reach him. But Nita didn't flinch. She ran, shovel in hand, embers glowing red. With a cry, she hurled fire. It struck Silas and his horse. He screamed. The horse screamed louder, reared, tossing him into the snow. His gun flew from his hand. The second hunter turned tail, galloping off. But Abel didn't look away. Silas rolled in the snow, coat smoldering, face burned, and Abel felt the rage, not like fire, but like ice. This wasn't anger, it was justice, and justice had a name. He had to erase the man who branded her, the one who put that terror in her eyes. Abel Harkin stormed toward Silas Gant. He grabbed the front of the man's scorched coat and yanked him upright. Silas whimpered, his face blistered and smeared with soot. Abel struck once, then again. He slammed Silas back against the cabin wall, the old logs creaking beneath the force. His left forearm pressed hard into Silas's throat, while his right, his killing hand, drew back. He was going to end this. For good. And then he heard her. Abel, please, Nita cried out. This time she clutched his arm, the one drawn to strike. Please, don't lose yourself. Not for me. Don't become him. He froze. His arm trembled. His whole body shook with the rage he'd kept buried for years. He stood on the edge of a cliff he swore he'd never cross. Don't, she whispered again, her tears soaking into the coarse fabric of his sleeve. He's not worth it. Abel exhaled, a guttural, soul-tearing sound. He looked down at the pitiful man trapped beneath his weight. Then to Nita, her face pale with fear, her eyes pleading, not for Silas, but for him. He released his grip. Silas dropped to the floor, choking and weeping. Abel stepped back, chest heaving. The fury still burned, alive and hungry inside him. But instead of killing, he turned to her. Get my journal, he growled. And the charcoal. She blinked. What? Now. Nita ran. When she returned, Abel ripped a page from the back. He hauled Silas by the hair, dragging him through the snow to the chopping block. He slammed the man's head down hard. You're going to sign a confession, Abel snarled. I can't see, Silas whimpered. You don't need to see. Just write. Abel seized Silas's hand. Or I'll take it, and you'll never hold a pen, a gun, or a woman again. Silas trembled as he reached for the charcoal. Write what I say, Abel barked. My name is Silas Gant. I held a woman named Nita against her will. I branded her. I abused her. I forged documents claiming she was my property. She is a free woman. The words came out crooked, barely legible. Sign it. Silas scribbled his name. Abel folded the paper, looked at Silas, then at the unconscious bounty hunter groaning in the snow. Put him on his horse, Abel ordered. It was pitiful. Silas, blistered and shaking, trying to hoist the man onto the saddle. It took 10 minutes. Then Abel picked up the revolver. He emptied the chambers and flung it into a snowdrift. did the same with the other man's pistol. "You ride out. You don't come back. If I see you again, she won't stop me." He turned to Silas's fine black horse. "You're walking." Silas stared, one good eye wide with disbelief. "It's a 2-day hike to the pass," he muttered. "I'll freeze." Abel didn't flinch. "Then you better get moving." He slapped the horse's flank, sending it trotting toward the lean-to. Silas limped away, dragging the bounty hunter behind, a smear of shame vanishing into the snowy pines. Abel watched until they were no more than a shadow. He stood for a long time, letting the cold bite into him. The cabin door clicked shut behind him. Soft, final. But he didn't return. He couldn't. He walked into the woods, to the ridge, and sat on the same log where he'd once seen tracks. He looked at his hands, still trembling. He hadn't killed. He hadn't broken his promise. But he'd wanted to. He had felt it. The dark satisfaction of his fist landing, the power of his rage unleashed. Nita had stopped him. But what about next time? 8 years hiding from the world hadn't rid him of the violence inside. 5 minutes with Nita brought it roaring back. He had thought he was a good man in hiding. He was wrong. He was a monster waiting to wake. The sun dipped low, staining the snow purple and pink. He couldn't go back. Couldn't face her, not after what she'd seen, not after what he'd almost done in her name. Inside the cabin, Nita wasn't crying. She was numb. She'd seen his face when he held Silas pinned. That wasn't Abel. That was someone else, a stranger, a man with dead eyes. She had stopped him, but he had crossed a line. Not with blood, but with intent. She had brought this violence to him, her shame, her scars, her presence. She had unearthed the killer he tried to bury. She looked around the cabin, the mended quilts, the worn table, his journal on the shelf. This was his refuge, and she had stained it. He would never forgive her. She had to go. No plan, no destination. Just go. She packed in silence, nothing much, just a wool shirt, the one he wore, the one he gave her, mended boots he had fixed, a sliver of dried meat, a slice of bananock. She reached under the pillow for the birch bark carving. It was gone. Her heart broke. He must have found it. Must have burned it. Her hand trembled on the door latch. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room. Then she stepped into the snow, not toward the pass, just away, toward the woods. Abel felt it, didn't see, but felt the door open, felt the hole it left. He bolted, charging through the snow, lungs burning, panic driving him like a stampede. He saw her, just a shadow at the tree line. "Nita!" he roared. She stopped, turned, a pale face in the dusk. He reached her, gasping, looming, breathless. "Don't," he said. "I have to," she whispered. "I'm the darkness. I bring it. I remind you of what you are." "What I am," he rasped. "You think that's who I am?" He dug in his pocket, trembling, and held something out in his weathered palm. The birch bark carving, W and J. "I found this," he said, voice thick. "Under the pillow. I was just looking for a clean shirt." He clenched it in his fist. This is the only thing that's felt real in 8 years." He looked into her eyes, desperate. "If you leave, I go back to silence. Not peace, emptiness. I can't survive that again. Don't leave me." She looked at this mountain of a man, trembling, holding her little carving like it was the last true thing left. She fell against him. Her legs just gave. She clung to him, face buried in his coat, the scent of pine and wood smoke and blood wrapping around her. He held her tight. They shook together in the snow, 2 broken souls wrapped around each other. "Then say it," she murmured into his chest. I'm done being property, done being a mistake. If I stay, I need to be yours." He pulled back, cradling her face in his hands. "You're mine," he said. A vow, a prayer, a brand of his own, not ownership, belonging. He touched the scar through her coat. "You're mine. Not for now, for always." The snow didn't melt. It surrendered. It drew back from the cabin, uncovering muddy earth and the scent of thaw. The silence of winter broke with rushing streams and dripping eaves. For Abel and Nita, it was resurrection. They had survived the cold, survived the fire. Now came the silence after. Their vow, for always, was still fragile, untested. But it was theirs. Worry still hung in the cabin, thick as mountain fog. Abel still watched the pass, though Silas wouldn't return. But fear now was deeper, of lawmen from 8 years back, of a world that didn't forgive. They worked, because work was the only way forward. "You know this lean-to won't survive another winter?" Abel said one morning, eyeing the cracked beam. So they rebuilt it. Nita wasn't clumsy anymore. Her hands, though scarred, were strong. She notched logs, mixed mud and straw. He taught, she learned. They moved in rhythm, silent partners in purpose. He'd lift, she'd brace. She found a patch of earth that thawed first. "We can plant here," she said, crumbling soil in her hands. Corn, beans, potatoes. He looked at her, face smudged with dirt, sun catching copper in her hair. She wasn't that broken girl from under the wagon anymore. She was his, and he was hers. She was growing stronger, day by day. Building a life took roots, and roots needed seeds, flour, salt, new axe heads. The pelts he'd trapped through the long winter were stacked high. Fox, marten, beaver, all cured and ready for trade. "We've got to head into town," Abel said. The words hit the air between them, heavy as a dropped hammer. Town meant eyes. Town meant memories. Town meant the world they'd both escaped from. "Yes," Nita replied, her voice pulled tight. "We need the supplies." They packed buckshot, loaded down with bundles of furs. Abel's own gelding stood ready, steady as always. And riding beside him, Nita sat tall on the mule, her shoulders squared. It was their first time leaving the hidden valley together. The trading town of Three Forks wasn't much, just a muddy street carved through pine country, flanked by weathered wood buildings, a general store, blacksmith, saloon rougher than sandpaper, and a tall, whitewashed church with a steeple that looked like it didn't belong. As they rode in, the town paused. A man rolling a barrel onto the porch froze mid-step, mouth half open. 2 leathery trappers tossed their cards aside near the smithy. Women exiting the store clutched their baskets closer. Abel looked like a walking mountain, scarred and towering, leading a pack animal heavy with wealth. That much the townsfolk could stomach. But it was Nita that stopped them cold. The men's stares were hungry. They'd passed through mining camps. They remembered her. She was the red-haired girl from the saloon, the one with fire in her eyes, the one they'd whispered about. Their gazes peeled her bare, wondering what she was now, wondering if she still carried a price. The women's stares were sharper, judgmental, cold. They saw sin riding beside a man, not her husband. They saw a woman who didn't belong. They saw a whore. Mothers pulled daughters closer, their mouths pinched tight. Nita's face flushed. She wanted to disappear, to drop her hat low, to vanish in the dust. Shame came crawling back, bitter in her throat. But Abel didn't look at them. He looked only at her, and in front of the whole town, he reached over, placed his gloved hand over hers on the reins, and held it firm. He said nothing, but that hand said everything. They rode to the general store like that, his hand covering hers. Abel dismounted, tied off the horses, then helped her down. His hands on her waist weren't shy. They said she's mine, and I'll stand with her and let the whole damn world look. I'll handle the trade, he murmured. No, she said, her voice trembling but steady. We do this together. He looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes and the steel beneath it, and nodded. Inside, the storekeeper couldn't stop his twitching eyes from landing on her, but the pelts were thick and prime. Trade was trade. As Abel haggled over prices, a shadow darkened the doorway. A tall, thin man in a worn black coat stepped inside. His face was gaunt, eyes burning cold. It was the preacher from that too-white church. He didn't look at Nita. He walked straight to Abel. You're the man from the mountains, he said, not asking. The one who hides in that cabin. I am, Abel replied. Then the preacher's gaze cut to Nita. Sharp, cruel. And this is the woman? Nita flinched. Abel shifted his stance, placing himself between them. This is Nita, he said flatly. I know what she is, the preacher snapped, his voice rising. The men talk. They know her from the camps. She's a whore, and you, sir, you bring shame to this valley. Nita went pale. Her knees nearly gave. This was the public branding, again. Abel didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stared at the preacher, long and calm. Preacher, he said, the word holding no malice. I lived in silence for 8 years, hiding from God, from people. I believed in nothing. I was empty. Then he turned slightly, his eyes softening as they found Nita. She is the only salvation I've ever known. The preacher opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no sermon for this kind of gospel. For the first time, he saw not sin, but something fierce and true. He turned and left, his coat flapping behind him. They finished their trade in silence, the stares still clinging, but changed, confused now, maybe even a little afraid. They rode out of Three Forks without a word. Deep in the woods, Nita stopped, slid off the mule, sat on a fallen log and broke down, not loud, but deep. Her shoulders shook. She clutched herself like she might fall apart. Abel dismounted and approached. He didn't touch her. He just stood by, steady and present. He was right, she whispered through tears. I am what he said. I brought all that filth from the camps to you. I ruined this. He was not right, Abel said. Then why does it hurt so bad? She cried. Why does love cost so much? He crouched in front of her, placed both hands on her trembling shoulders. Because, he said, voice raw and quiet, it's the only thing worth the price. She melted into his arms, sobbing against his chest. He held her like a shield against the world. They returned to the cabin at sundown. The silence of the valley welcomed them back, but the day had left its mark. A few mornings later, Abel sniffed the wind. Wood smoke, he muttered. Not ours. At the porch lay a pie, still warm, covered with clean cheesecloth. Nita lifted it slowly. Apple. Abel looked up the ridge. A woman on a mule was riding away, the same one from the store. Her stare that day hadn't been judgment. It had been recognition. Nita sat down on the porch, the pie in her lap, and wept. But not from shame, from kindness. The next week, Abel rode into town alone. Nita stayed back. When he returned, dusk on his shoulders, his face unreadable, she felt her chest tighten. What is it? I ran into the preacher's son, he said. He was in the freight office back when you were at Gold Dust. Nita's heart dropped. He saw everything Rickard did, and he never forgave himself. He gave that signed confession to a passing marshal. What happened? She whispered. Rickard's been arrested, Abel said. Fraud, kidnapping, assault. He's in federal custody. He's gone, Nita. She didn't cry. She just let out a breath she'd held for 5 years. Life finally exhaled. Spring rolled into summer. The corn came up. The cabin began to feel like a real home. But small. Too small for the two of them, now no longer strangers. Abel started drawing again, but not hawks. He sketched her, kneeling in the garden, kneading dough, sleeping in firelight. He gave her the journal. This is yours. She turned the pages. It wasn't Clara, the saloon girl. It was Nita. Strong, capable, real. He hadn't drawn the brand, hadn't drawn the scars. Only the woman he saw. This, she whispered, is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me. Next morning, he took his axe, not to the woodpile, but to the pine grove. What are we doing? She asked. It's too small, he said, nodding at the cabin. A man and a woman. They need a space that's theirs. They built it together. He felled the trees. She helped drag them. They tore down the north wall and built a new room. It wasn't an addition. It was a beginning. She hung pine garlands inside. He placed the old pie tin on the mantel. And his rifle, once a weapon, he hung above the doorway, not as defense, but as memory. The summer sun stretched across the valley, and their quiet world, once broken, now stood whole. The heat came down hard, clean and bright, soaking everything until even the pine trees smelled like they'd been steeped in sunlight. The corn Abel and Nita had planted was shoulder high now, waving green like a promise. The new barn stood strong, the scent of sun-warmed pine mixing with goats and dust. Their life had settled into something steady. Not silence like before, not the silence of strangers or the frozen kind that huddled inside a blizzard, but something easy, a kind of peace where a man could pass a tool without asking, and a woman could hand him water without words. Their hands would brush. Their movements lined up like they'd always belonged together. But the world hadn't forgotten them. One afternoon, a wagon creaked up the mountain trail. Abel saw it first. His hand paused on the axe, body tensed like old instincts still lived in his bones. But it wasn't danger this time. It was Pastor Eli Turner, his fire gone, replaced with something quieter. Beside him stood his son, the boy who once delivered a letter full of ghosts. Mr. Abel, Pastor Eli said, climbing down. He didn't call him by a last name. No one knew it. We're opening a new registry, he said, holding up a thick, leather-bound book. Territory's growing. Railroads bringing settlers. If you want to keep this land yours, so no one can claim it, you gotta write it down. Abel looked at Nita. He'd bled for this land. 8 years of quiet penance. She'd survived for it, planted hope in it. We don't got no real claim, he said flatly, as if the earth itself might rise to disagree. Not by the law. Pastor Turner didn't blink. The law's about what's written, he said, and what's written can change. Folks down the mountain, they know you. They know Nita. They call you the couple up by the ridge. Mrs. Weller, she vouched for you, said this place was earned. He opened the book. There's a space here for a family, 160 acres. Yours, if you want it. Abel stared at the blank line. A family? That word felt foreign, like something fragile that didn't belong to them. It costs, he said. No, sir, the preacher's son replied. We took care of the fee. Debt's been paid. His eyes were on Nita, full of quiet admiration. What does it need? Nita asked. wiping garden dirt on her apron. "A name," said the pastor. "A family name." Abel had none worth keeping. The one he carried was a warrant. He looked at her, at the woman who'd taken his name in every way that mattered. "Abel," he said. "The name is Abel, that's all. We're the Harkin family now." The preacher nodded and wrote it down. "Harkin and Nita," she added softly. He penned both, then closed the book. "One more thing," the pastor said, fumbling with his hat. "Registry assumes a bond, legal." "You mean marriage?" Abel said. "Yes," the preacher replied, cheeks flushed. "It'd make it official." Nita looked at Abel, saw the flicker of defiance in his eyes. The world always asked for proof, for papers, for things you had to survive just to deserve. "We ain't church folks," Abel said. "God's not just in the church," the preacher answered quietly. "He's in how two people hold each other up when nothing else will. I learned that from you." "If you want it," he said, "I can marry you. Not for the land, for the bond." They said yes by the stream, the same stream that once froze over when they first met. The sun blazed and the water ran clear. No crowd, no flowers, just Pastor Turner, his son, and Mrs. Weller. Nita didn't wear a gown, just her best wool shirt, the one Abel had mended. She tucked blue wildflowers in her hair. Abel wore a clean shirt, too, fresh shaven, his scar pale and clear like an old trail on his face. The preacher didn't speak of sin. He talked about building, about roots, about broken things growing strong together, no rings. When the time came, Abel just took her hand. "You are one," the preacher said, voice thick. "What this world tried to tear apart, let it now be whole. You are man and wife." Mrs. Weller sniffled. Abel didn't kiss her, just looked at her. Everything he couldn't say, he said with his eyes. And hand in hand, they walked back to the cabin. That night, something shifted. The cabin felt more solid, the air easier to breathe. It was theirs now, by law and by vow. Nita lit the fire. The high country nights still cooled with the wind. Abel sat in the chair he'd carved, watching her. She finished her task, then crossed the room, quiet and sure. Stood in front of him, her shadow dancing on the wall. "Husband," she said. The word caught fire in the room. Strange, beautiful, real. He had no answer. She reached for his hands, those calloused, scarred hands that had harmed and healed, and placed them over her chest, where the old wounds lay. "I know you were scared," she whispered. "That first time, scared you'd burn me." She pressed his hands tighter. "I'd rather burn with you," she said. He rose and cupped her face. The kiss wasn't desperate or shy. It was home. He lifted her, carried her to the bed they'd built with their own hands. And they made love, not out of need, not to escape, but out of trust. It was soft, fumbling, tender. Her laughter came like sunlight. His touch was reverent. When he kissed the place where a bruise once lived, it was whole. They wept, not from sorrow, but from healing. They slept as one. Months passed. The corn was gathered. Snow came, but this time it was a blanket, not a prison. The cabin stayed warm. They had roots. Spring returned. One morning, Abel came in from the barn, his hands still slick from the goats. Nita wasn't inside. He saw her, out by the bean poles, on her knees in the dirt. Her shoulders were shaking. Fear surged through him. He ran. "Nita, what is it?" He dropped beside her. She looked up, tears running wild. "I was just planting seeds," she whispered, voice cracking. "And I looked up, saw the cabin, smoke in the chimney, knew you were in the barn." She shook her head. I never thought I'd live long enough to feel safe." The words tore through him like wind across a field. He took her hand, pressed it into the dirt beside his. "Then let's plant roots," he said, steady as ever, deep enough never to be torn loose. The story closes years later. The cabin's bigger now. A full porch wraps around it. The barn's sturdy. Children laugh by the stream. Abel Harkin stands behind his wife on the porch, arms around her waist. His hair's grayed, the scar on his face silvered with age. She's older too. Red hair threaded with white, hands worn but steady. Their fingers are laced together. They look out at the Wind River Mountains, sun bleeding gold and crimson into the sky. The past still lingers. In the scar on his face. In the way she flinches when voices rise. But love has claimed it all. Love has stitched their wounds into vows, built a home out of silence, taken a giant and a runaway, and made them whole,